Thanks so much, Mark and Melanie, for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor to be speaking on this panel with so many of the leaders in this field, and I'm particularly indebted to Dr. Pereira for all of the work that she's done to pioneer this field, but also for covering a lot of the topic area that I'm looking at here. So I'm speaking today on early life exposure, so both prenatal and childhood exposure to ambient air pollution and cognitive function. And I'm going to start off with a review of some of the recent evidence on air pollution and both cognitive and behavioral function, looking at prenatal and childhood exposure. Then take you through some work that I was involved in looking at prenatal and childhood exposure to traffic-related air pollution and neurodevelopment in Project Viva, and give some summary and thoughts on future directions in this field. So I think it was mentioned by an earlier speaker that there's been a real increase in work in this area in the last 5 years. But prior to the last 5 years, there was pioneering work, especially from Dr. Pereira's group and their work in New York City and Poland, on prenatal PAHs and a range of measures of childhood cognition and behavior. There were also a number of cross-sectional studies in children that suggested potential influence of childhood exposure to air pollution on cognition, behavior, and ADHD diagnosis. In Boston, where Project Viva is based, in another cohort, there had been associations of childhood black carbon exposure with both worse cognition and attention at ages 8 to 11. So that was really sort of one of the motivations for the research that we did in Project Viva, which I will say more about later in the talk. But as I mentioned, the last 5 years have really seen a growth in this work, and wanted to take you through a few studies that have come out recently. This is not a comprehensive literature review, but some important findings that I think are moving us towards having further confidence in the association. So the European study of cohorts of air pollution effects, or ESCAPE, is a study we've already heard about a few times. This is a big collaboration of European researchers that is looking at air pollution effects across the life course on many different health outcomes, but it incorporates European birth cohorts from a number of countries with recruitment from 1992 to 2008, and looks at associations of neurodevelopmental impacts in those cohorts with modeled air pollution for all of those countries. So these researchers have modeled nitrogen dioxide and NOx, along with fine particulate absorbance, and PM10, as well as the coarse fraction of PM. So a number of different particulate measures. In a pooled study of 6 of those cohorts, prenatal PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide were associated with psychomotor development, so lower global psychomotor development scores at ages 1 through 6. And you can see here plots that display the effect estimates and 95% confidence intervals across the pooled cohorts, with the diamonds at the bottom displaying the pooled effect estimate for all the cohorts. And across all cohorts, there was an effect with global psychomotor development scores, but not with general cognition or language development. One thing to note about this pooled analysis was that most of the children were assessed at ages 2 or younger, so it may have been a little early to really see some of the important outcomes that are easier to assess later on, specifically with regards to general cognition and language. This ESCAPE group has also recently published on prenatal air pollution exposure and ADHD symptoms on variety of rating scales and did not see an association with prenatal air pollution exposure and odds ratios for ADHD symptoms in the borderline or clinical range in children aged 3 to 10. We've already spoken a bit in this panel about potential differences in these European cohorts. I think something else to consider is that when you dichotomize these scales into either clinical borderline or not, you may end up with outcome misclassification. You may also have some degree of exposure misclassification in these studies. If these are subtle effects, that may wash out the ability to see associations. There's also some evidence and a commentary that was published alongside this paper in Epidemiology suggesting that factors like socioeconomics that may influence misclassification of both outcome and exposure. If misclassification of both outcome and exposure are linked, you can have unexpected and large biases that may make it challenging to detect associations. And I think, as we discussed earlier, this is also prenatal exposure. So these pooled studies have not looked at postnatal exposure. So some other recent studies on prenatal exposure, one in Cincinnati, Ohio, that saw associations of traffic-related elemental carbon in the first year of life with hyperactive behaviors at age 7, using a land use regression for elemental carbon. A study in a Rome, Italy cohort of children that observed higher residential traffic proximity and NO2 exposure at birth was associated with lower verbal IQ at age 7. These used the same escape land use regression models. And they saw weaker associations with postnatal exposure. Similar effects with birth to age 7, but weaker associations with exposure in the year before cognitive assessment. And a large nationwide study in Japan, which saw associations of nitrogen dioxide and PM exposure in the prenatal period with behavioral delays at age 2 and 5, using municipal level data from regulatory monitoring. So there's also been some really important recent research on childhood exposure, and a lot of that has come out of the BREATHE study, which is a cohort of school-based cohort in Barcelona, where schools were selected based on traffic exposure. They selected 20 schools with high traffic exposure, 20 with low. I think they got 39 of those schools to participate, and the schools were matched on socioeconomic characteristics and type of school. They took indoor and outdoor measurements at the schools of a range of traffic-related pollutants, and they did 4 repeated assessments over the course of a year of cognitive development, both working memory and attention. And they saw quite dramatically that higher traffic-related pollution exposure at school was associated with slower cognitive development. So you can see here across the 4 visits, the dashed line is the students at the higher pollution schools. The solid line is the students at the lower pollution schools. And the baseline, they start a little lower, although not statistically significantly lower, but over time, their development of working memory, which is what's displayed here, is slower. And they saw that for just the high traffic versus low traffic schools, but they also saw associations with elemental carbon, nitrogen dioxide, and ultrafine particles measured both outdoors in courtyards of the schools and also indoors in classrooms. So this shows both associations with traffic, outdoors, and indoors. They followed that study up 3 years later and saw that these developmental trajectories continued to be slower in children with the higher primary school traffic exposure, even 3 years later. And that study estimated that an IQR, or interquartile range, increase in the exposure to traffic-related pollutants was associated with 10 to 20% slower development of working memory per year. so quite substantial reductions. In that same study, they also looked at did elemental analysis of measures taken in the classrooms and in the courtyards, did factor analysis to evaluate sources of PM 2.5, and saw that specifically for PM 2.5 from the traffic source, there were associations with both indoor, which are the black diamonds, and outdoor, which are the open circles, concentrations of traffic-related factor, PM 2.5, with specifically working memory and inattentiveness. Whereas PM 2.5 with other sources did not show associations with these outcomes. The study has also demonstrated suggestions of an acute association of pollution with attention. So looking at daily time series of pollution measured at central monitors and taking advantage of the fact that they have repeated measures in individual children, they've been able to look at associations with performance differences within a child associated with the air pollution the day before they took the assessments, the day of and the day before that as well. But they see the strongest association here with a 1-day lag. So air pollution the day before these assessments were taken were associated with lower performance. And this type of acute assessment is much less susceptible to residual confounding by socioeconomic factors, as well as potentially exposure misclassification. You can see here on the right, they continue to see associations with long-term exposure as well, but there's independent and separate associations with short-term exposure. And in the study, they've also looked at noise, which is often correlated with air pollution, and have seen independent and separate associations of noise and pollution on different outcomes. So this was a study where they looked at the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, which assesses behavioral outcomes, and also the DSM-4 questionnaire for ADHD symptoms, and saw associations of elemental carbon with SDQ scores and noise with ADHD scores. So some other recent studies, a large study looking at all of the large national exams taken by Israeli high school students also saw potentially acute associations of PM 2.5 and carbon monoxide on the day of exams with lower scores, and that was also looking at repeated scores in individual children. And another study has observed that adolescent exposure to residential traffic exposure, so traffic where you live, is associated with decreased sustained attention. That brings me to showing some of the results that we saw in the Project Viva cohort in Boston. And when we set out to do this study, we were looking to assess the influence of prenatal and early life exposure to traffic-related air pollution on both childhood cognition and childhood executive function and behavior problems. And we wanted to examine sensitive developmental windows, so both prenatal and childhood exposure, try to identify particularly harmful components or sources of air pollution and specific cognitive and behavioral domains that are affected. The study population is a Boston-based birth cohort, just over 2,100 mother-child pairs enrolled in the late 90s, early 2000s. They conducted regular in-person study visits, and 1,100 of the children completed cognitive assessments at mid-childhood, median age 8, and mothers and classroom teachers also completed assessments of the children's executive function and behavior problems at the same visit. We used several assessments of exposure. The first was traffic exposure. So we looked at roadway proximity, or the distance of the child or mother's residence to the nearest major road, both at birth and at the time of the cognitive assessment. We also looked at near residence traffic density, so the length of all roads multiplied by the traffic counts on those roads within 100 meters of the residence. And we used land use regression to model exposure to black carbon and fine particulate matter at the residence. So in terms of the cognitive assessments, we saw associations between roadway proximity at birth and lower IQ and visual motor abilities when these children were 7 and 10. So this was the roadway proximity of the mother during pregnancy. And you can see we have 3 categories of roadway proximity: greater than 200 meters, 50 to 200 meters, less than 50 meters. And among the children who were born to mothers living less than 50 meters from a major roadway, we saw decrements in verbal IQ, nonverbal IQ, and visual motor abilities. Pretty wide confidence intervals reflecting the fact that not that many women lived this close to a major roadway, which is a good thing, but definitely a suggestion that there may be decrements associated with this really near roadway residence. Didn't see associations with some of the other assessments. We looked at design memory and picture memory. And these models were adjusted for a lot of characteristics of the child, the mother, including maternal IQ, and the father and the household and neighborhood. We also looked at childhood roadway proximity, and that was less strongly associated with nonverbal IQ and not related to the other outcomes. So it looked like the prenatal roadway proximity was more influential in these associations. We didn't see associations with traffic density or PM 2.5, and although we saw associations with black carbon and verbal IQ in minimally adjusted models, those associations were no longer present, or in some cases somewhat reversed with adjustment for socioeconomic covariates. So there was a lot of association, there was a strong correlation between black carbon exposure in this population and sociodemographic factors. So we saw that living in very close proximity to major roadways during pregnancy was associated with substantial decrements in children's cognitive function. This reduction we saw in nonverbal IQ of 7.5 points is quite substantial in a analysis of an international pooled analysis of effects of blood lead. The impact of increasing from the 5th to 95th percentile, or from about 2 micrograms per deciliter to 30 micrograms per deciliter of blood lead, is on the order of 7 points. So I think, as Dr. Pereira indicated, this is definitely in a range that's potentially of public health relevance. And we are not able to say what explains this roadway proximity effect. It could be attributable to components of tailpipe emissions other than black carbon or PM 2.5 that we weren't able to measure, such as ultrafine particles. It could also be related to road dust, noise, neighborhood characteristics, or some combination of all of these things. And to show what I think has been referred to by prior speakers, there is a rapid drop-off for many traffic-related pollutants within the first 100 meters as you get away from roadways. PM 2.5 and nitrogen dioxide have less rapid decay and are sort of more secondary pollutants. So there's things that we didn't measure in this study that could explain this association. A paper was published by our group last week suggesting one potential mechanism for this association of roadway proximity with childhood neurodevelopment. In cord blood DNA methylation at 4 CpG sites on the LAM2 gene, which is known to be related to axonal development, were associated with residential proximity to major roadways at birth. So you can see those in this Manhattan plot showing up as sticking out as more methylated among children with higher proximity to roadways at birth. Those 4 CpG sites were also associated with nonverbal IQ scores at mid-childhood to a varying degree. This association hasn't been seen consistently in other cohorts, so it's more of sort of a hypothesis-generating exercise, but it suggests an important mechanism for further study. When we looked at behavior and executive function we saw associations of black carbon exposure with teacher-rated executive function. On the left are effect estimates and 95% confidence intervals for black carbon in the third trimester, or prenatal black carbon. On the right is black carbon in the year of behavioral assessment. And we did not see as much of an association here with prenatal black carbon exposure. We saw a stronger association with postnatal and childhood black carbon exposure, although similar to the prior analyses, some attenuation with adjustment for sociodemographic covariates, reflecting the relationship between sociodemographic covariates and black carbon in this population. But we saw, even after adjustment for many, many covariates, still an association that remained between behavioral regulation in particular and black carbon in the year of behavioral assessment. When we looked, we broke that out by specific year of exposure and saw that early years were less associated, later years were more associated with teacher-rated behavioral regulation. So this is suggesting that actually the later childhood period for this outcome, behavioral regulation, may be more influential. And this may relate to the timing of development of the prefrontal cortex, which is an important determinant of behavioral regulation and has also been seen in a lot of studies to be a target potentially sensitive region with regards to traffic-related pollution. So some additional findings, childhood traffic density and PM 2.5 exposures were less strongly related to these outcomes. We saw a suggestion of an association with near roadway proximity at birth and in childhood, but big confidence intervals and a non-statistically significant association. And we didn't see adverse associations with another behavioral assessment we looked at, the SDQ, which assesses problem behaviors, or with assessments completed by parents. So we saw childhood black carbon exposure was associated with greater problems with behavior regulation, while prenatal black carbon exposure was not. Black carbon exposures, as I've mentioned, are strongly related to socioeconomic factors in this population. And in many populations, there, as has been discussed, there are persistent disparities in environmental exposures to air pollution by race and socioeconomic factors in the United States. So this is something that is a challenge in a lot of work in this field, is really disentangling these effects or potentially understanding the combined effects of both of these stressors. So the summary of the findings from both of these studies together suggests that roadway proximity in the prenatal period is associated with lower cognitive development in children, whereas higher childhood but not prenatal black carbon exposure was associated with behavioral regulation. So this indicates that there may be, that the relevant exposure windows may vary across across cognitive function. So to link back to the other work, and I'll try to tie together the evidence that I've presented, there's numerous cohort studies suggesting impacts of prenatal air pollution exposure on childhood cognitive development. Large European pooled studies have observed an association of air pollution exposure with psychomotor development, but not general cognition, language development, or ADHD symptoms. But for a variety of reasons, those studies may be limited in their ability to reflect what we're seeing in some of these other cohort studies. Childhood exposure to air pollution is associated with worse cognition, attention, and behavioral regulation. And I think that's something that's important to draw out here, that the childhood period is potentially just as vulnerable or more vulnerable for some of these outcomes as the prenatal period. And the BREATHE study, the school-based study in Barcelona, suggests that childhood exposure to traffic-related pollution at school slows cognitive development and can acutely impact attention, which has really important implications for potential interventions to protect children's health. So future directions, we need more understanding of the relative contributions of multiple pollutants, noise, the built environment, and the use of novel statistical methods for complex mixtures may help us with this. This is important for research, of course, but also for understanding where we can intervene to have impacts that protect children's health, as a number of the prior speakers have discussed. There's also a need for further exploration of vulnerable brain functions and regions, and neuroimaging is beginning to give us more insight into this topic, and we've seen, and I think we'll see more on that from other speakers. And I think I focused a bit on, throughout the talk, on the exposure assessment methodologies that were used. I think most of the work in this field right now relies on either regulatory monitoring data that's then attributed to entire municipalities or areas, or land use regression models that are more highly resolved but limited by the terms that are in those land use regression models. So are able to show us things that we, able to demonstrate relationships that we understand already about, roadway proximity potentially for certain pollutants, but may not give us the full understanding of true variability in air pollution exposure. And of course, the role of microenvironments and indoor exposures is another important component here. Some of the personal monitoring studies have shown that indoor environments can be very influential. Commuting exposure, time in cars, time on roads, and time at school, as we see in the Breathe cohort, are really important to understand. I think time activity and location tracking is something that's going to help us better refine exposure measurements as we move forward, as well as higher resolution measures of ambient pollution. So just to give a quick plug for the work going on at Environmental Defense Fund, where I am now. This isn't showing up very well, but EDF has been focused over the last several years on efforts to map hyperlocal air pollution and understand associations with health. So this is an image of West and downtown Oakland, where there's one regulatory monitoring site for air pollution. In 2015 to 2016, EDF partnered with a number of other organizations, including an environmental justice organization in West Oakland, the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, researchers from Josh Apte's group at University of Texas at Austin, and Google Earth Outreach, along with Acoma, a sensor manufacturer, to collect data on roads of black carbon, nitric oxide, and nitrogen dioxide using fast response sensors on Google Street View cars that spent a year going continuously through these neighborhoods. And this study demonstrated that median pollution levels tend to be actually pretty stable, at least in this area. When you get enough drives, you start to see stable patterns that are spatially variable. And when you look at those spatial patterns, you can see a lot of variability even within a single city block. So differences in pollutant concentration of 5 to 8 times. And also notable is that many areas in this region had higher pollution level than those measured at the central regulatory monitor. And also, I think it's notable that you can see things when you look at maps like this that probably would not be predicted by a land use regression because they relate to sources that we didn't expect to see or that we would not have had terms for in a land use regression. So it's not just roadway proximity, but things like proximity to a metal recycling plant in the neighborhood that start to show up and may help refine understanding of what people are being exposed to and where the opportunities are to intervene. EDF has also collaborated with Kaiser Permanente Division of Research to do a study looking at electronic medical records of 41,000 people insured by Kaiser in this area, and looked at associations with air pollution at residential address and cardiovascular outcomes. And that study demonstrated that among elderly residents, there were associations with the hyper-resolved air pollution outside your house, so at the 30-meter level, the scale that this map in the center is on, and cardiovascular disease event incidence. We worked with those authors to develop some visualizations that would demonstrate for the community what the health impacts really were. And this map on the right shows that elderly residents, which is where we saw this association, living in areas of Oakland with the highest concentrations of nitrogen dioxide would have greater than 40% more risk of a cardiovascular disease event than those in less polluted areas. So it starts to demonstrate the degree of variability and associated variability in health outcomes that could occur on even a intra-neighborhood scale. So I want to, I would be very happy to talk more about the EDF work with others. I know it's slightly off topic here, but I think it's very relevant. So you can catch me at lunch. I want to acknowledge a lot of collaborators on the Project Viva work at UC Berkeley, Boston University, Project Viva, Harvard, Boston Children's Hospital, and other places, as well as the funders for that work and the participants and staff of Project Viva. And thank you again for having me.